Put your seat in its upright and locked position, fasten your safety belt, and hold on, because the Baldy and the Blonde show is about to launch. Broadcasting live from the Booth of Truth in the WGSO studio in the heart of New Orleans, your hosts for an hour of power, Tom Kowitz and Michele Gaudin.
Oh, Shelley, our foreign policy means no border security, 'cause we're broke and not here. We're guarding everyone else.
Yeah, while we leave our own borders wide open and make enemies of the likes of you and me.
Yeah, I mean, it's, but you know, the real reason, well, I'll let you tell them who we have today.
Well, we have
and then I'll tell them why.
We have a terrific guest today, yet another eminent guest here on Baldy and the Blonde. Today it is retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor, PhD and all-around good guy. He's a retired colonel from the U.S. Army who's got excellent credentials with regard to foreign policy and national security. He's written 4 books. He's testified as an expert witness on national security issues in front of the House Armed Services Committee and the House Foreign Relations Committee. And he believes strongly, like a lot of people in the U.S. military and like at least one presidential candidate, in a non-interventionist foreign policy.
What does that mean?
Well, we'll let him explain.
Sounds like he agrees.
There's a huge difference between non-intervention and isolationism.
Yes, there is, and that's a question that we have to deal with all the time. But I hear from a lot of people, gee, I really like Ron Paul's domestic policy. Lots of people love his economic ideas. But then they'll say, but, you know, I'm just not too sure about his foreign policy. And I think that after as many years as we've been sort of brainwashed to think that we need to be in every country in the world or else we're going to get attacked, it's understandable. And I certainly used to be a hawk, but
I hear that a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of people are saying now that it wasn't very long ago, just a couple of years ago or less. They were hawks and neocons and warmongers, whatever you want to call them. And now they realize, after listening to reason and seeing what's going on and that this is breaking us, that just doesn't make sense. And we had, remember, it wasn't so long ago, we had very high-level ranking CIA officer Michael Scheuer on here. He was, for several years, chief of the Bin Laden unit in the Middle East. And he agrees with this position. We are spreading ourselves too thin. We're spending too much on the military. And that this interventionist foreign policy is going to break us. And so now we have another guest coming on. In fact, he's on the line now. We'll bring him on here in just a moment to discuss the same thing. And I would challenge anybody out there to ask yourself, do you think you know better than the likes of these guys?
And after all, it certainly seems that the military itself, just the rank and file, have overwhelmingly supported Ron Paul over all of the other candidates, Democratic and Republican.
You think it might be because they'd like to come home?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's because they see that what they're doing is you know, it has nothing to do with our national defense.
Right.
If we want to have a national defense, how about we stop having a national offense? Anyway.
Well, without further ado, we do have our guest on the line, Colonel Macgregor, retired Colonel Macgregor. We have already basically done the introduction. We'll just bring you on board right now. Welcome.
Hi, how you doing?
Excellent. Thank you for joining us today. For starters, would you explain to our audience the difference between a non-interventionist foreign policy and one of isolationism?
Sure. Well, isolationism is a word that really has no relevance today. It suggests that we're going to live in some sort of Jeffersonian republic remote from the rest of the world, toiling away on our farms in splendid isolation. And we all know that that sort of thing is not only impossible, but was never really possible even when Jefferson advocated that kind of utopian lifestyle here in the United States. And Ron Paul absolutely does not advocate that. What he advocates is that instead of confronting the world on the battlefield, we should confront the world in the marketplace. And that the best way to export American values, governmental concepts and ideas is through economic interaction by essentially being the world's engine of prosperity. And that is not isolationism, but that suggests that intervening in the affairs of other countries with the use of American military power is something that one resorts to only as a last resort, not as a first resort, and only when our national strategic interests are genuinely threatened.
And Colonel Macgregor, Do you believe that our national interest and our national security is threatened by Afghanistan, Iraq, or Iran?
No, I don't. I think that there has been a tendency to conflate any manifestation of hostility to the United States, to the West, to Israel, with an immediate requirement or need to bludgeon the source of that hostility immediately with American military power. And we know from experience it doesn't work very well. And these interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan have both been self-defeating. Iraq is now in the hands of our competing adversary, Iran, who controls events in Baghdad and events in Iraq, not the United States. And they've managed that by expending a fraction of the amount of money that we have. And in Afghanistan, we've been defending a narco state run by somebody we thought was our puppet, Karzai, and it's really not about us at all. What's going on in Afghanistan has a great deal more to do with the conflict and competition between India and Pakistan.
Is our national security being diminished by our presence in these countries?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you stroll through the halls of the Pentagon, you're not going to find very many people that contest that position. Most have concluded that a very light footprint of U.S. military power overseas is infinitely better and more effective than the extraordinarily heavy presence that we've maintained, particularly in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf.
Why do you suppose it is that in the corporate-controlled media that the opposite message is the one that has the traction, the message that we need to be over there?
Well, that's an important question, and that comes up very frequently. And I think people in the United States need to understand that you have a kind of bipartisan elite inside the Beltway that consists of people on the left and people on the what I would call just barely center-right in the Republican Party, people who have been part of the Washington political community and Wall Street beneficiaries for many decades. And they've grown up in this environment where the United States was the center of the world, and that nothing could happen without the United States' involvement in some way. Remember that at the end of the Second World War, we were effectively the only ones left standing. Everyone else had fought themselves to a point of total and utter exhaustion. And so we represented 60-70% of world gross national product or gross domestic product. And today, we're down at about 30% and falling. And people interpret that as a dangerous sign and evidence for decay. And in reality, the rest of the world is now recovered and is ready to get on with its own affairs. And we need to understand that the world has changed. We need to adapt to that reality rather than be reactionary and treat it as though this is a danger to us. It's not. And we can do business with the rest of the world.
And wouldn't that benefit our economy?
Oh, enormously. Absolutely. There's no question about it. I mean, we've imposed sanctions on all sorts of people and places for many, many years, and there isn't much evidence that those sanctions do any good, that they achieve any of the aims that we've established. But remember, you've got lots of moralizing hypocrites who are part of this elite. They're not part of the organizations or the groups or the formations that will be committed to action militarily. Neither are their relatives or their offspring or anything else. They see it as their God-given right to decide what is in the interest of the American people. And the American people, let's be frank, have been largely absent from the discussion. I mean, most Americans, whether they live in St. Louis or Seattle, Washington, are not really terribly concerned about what happens beyond the borders of America. And if the media tells them that, we're wielding the righteous sword of intervention on behalf of some moral cause, most Americans are predisposed to listen to that and believe it without questioning anything. And that's how you lose $4 trillion. Tens of thousands of American lives are destroyed, millions of the lives of people who are largely irrelevant to us strategically and were never really our enemies. Their lives are destroyed, and we cultivate tens of millions of new enemies.
What really disturbs me, I guess, and I rant about it every week, is the fact that Americans are just handing over their constitutionally protected rights right and left under the guise of protection from terrorism. How would you tie in Ron Paul's ideas and your ideas with regard to a non-interventionist foreign policy and what effect it would have on the potential terrorist threats that the U.S. faces?
Well, first of all, I think there's reason for optimism, and in fact, there's reason for celebration, because I think Ron Paul's views are emerging triumphant with each passing day. I run into people personally. I also look at polling data, and it's abundantly clear that two things are happening. First of all, more and more Americans are coming to terms with the reality that our economy is not recovering, that we are at severe risk, that this $16 trillion debt presents a lethal existential threat to our republic, that we're not going to be able to spend and print money in perpetuity. We're certainly not going to be able to borrow in perpetuity at 2% interest, and that the future is grim, that we've got a serious fiscal crisis looming. We've got to bring back manufacturing. We've got to get capital back in the United States. If we don't, we're not going to get people back to work. So let's say that it's very clear to me that certainly Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum have adopted that. I wish Romney would, instead of sort of being another neo-Keynesian who talks much like people on the left about the economy. Hopefully he'll come around to that. So I think we're winning that particular argument. Now, the second part on the foreign and defense policy, I think, is also increasingly a win for people that subscribe to Ron Paul's philosophy. And people are beginning to question, what good is it? Why should we attack Iran? For instance, Iran is a nation of 78 million people that spends less on defense every year than Greece, which is a nation of 11 million. The Iranians can't project military power beyond their borders, and their subversive activities, if you will, are really limited to other Shiite Arab populations, which is why the Saudis and the Gulf Emirates are afraid of them, and that's why the Arabs in Lebanon are afraid of the Shiites that have grown very powerful there. But they don't learn the right lessons. We haven't yet figured out completely that any form of occupation by us of other countries, particularly in the third world and most particularly in the Muslim world, is a prescription for disaster. People don't want that. No one. I mean, look, I grew up in North Philadelphia, and I can tell you if you'd sent the Marine Corps and the Army into our neighborhoods, after a couple of weeks, we probably would have shot at them too. Nobody wants to be occupied. Let's wake up, smell the coffee. That's, we're Americans. We should understand people's desire to determine their own futures and destinies. We should understand that our country is exceptional, and it's because it's exceptional, because we are culturally and politically and economically different from most of the world, that we can't export what we have at gunpoint to other people and expect them to adopt it and use it.
And I don't know, I just don't believe that's really our motive anyway. Are we really over in Afghanistan, or anywhere in the Middle East trying to spread democracy, or are we there for other reasons?
Well, there's not much reason to be in Afghanistan other than to attack and destroy the few al-Qaeda elements that were in the country. And as we know, al-Qaeda has long since retreated into northwest Pakistan. It's actually very isolated. What's frustrating, I think, is that the international police organizations, our own intelligence agencies, the Central Intelligence Agency and others, have actually done a very fine job of isolating the few al-Qaeda types, which amount to perhaps 150, 200 people, in northwest Pakistan. They don't have access to funds. They don't have access to communications. They're increasingly irrelevant, and we have succeeded in demolishing them and killing them. Unfortunately, to go back to your earlier point, our behavior has encouraged others in many parts of the Muslim world to sort of open independent franchises and associate themselves with this al-Qaeda movement in frustration with our behavior. So, we've cultivated new enemies, and one way to stop it is by adopting this lighter footprint and getting, for the most part, out of these places militarily. But then if you want to be certain that you're going to be safe, you're going to have to control your borders. You're going to have to control immigration, legal and illegal, and we simply haven't. So we've already got people inside the United States who are anti-American, who are hostile to us, have no intention of ever becoming Americans, and in fact, many of them are terrorists. There's no question about it. That's real. They're here. It's unfortunate, but that's what happens when you don't control those things and you leave the borders open.
And yet, control of the borders is one of the very few mandated federal powers, and we don't do it.
That's right.
It's crazy.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, that's what you have the armed forces for, and it's why I've repeatedly argued that we need to put U.S. Army forces today on the border with Mexico. We don't even control vast territories that are adjacent to Mexico inside the United States. They're now dominated by drug cartels, criminals, and so forth.